Hi there, friends. It's Seth Koster with Telepractice Tech Tips. Let's dive right in. Today, our topic is GPUs, CPUs, RAM. Oh my! But don't you worry, because today, we're going to take you from this to this. So what is all this stuff? Well, as a speech-language pathologist, I like to think of it in terms that I can understand. The brain. I want you to reach way back to your university days and think about your neuroanatomy. Well, anyways, we can kind of think of it like this. The hard drive is like the hippocampus and the neocortex, where much of our long-term memory is stored. For example, that penguins are the best birds in the world, and that if cats had wings, they would even be better birds than penguins. For our computers, it holds all of our documents and pictures and everything else. 1 byte is 1 character in the alphabet. So the letter P will take 1 byte to store. 1 gigabyte is about 1 billion bytes. A little bit more, but basically about 1 billion bytes. That's about 4,500 books at 200 pages each. So if you have a 500 gigabyte hard drive, well, you do the math. I mean, seriously, you do the math. I'm a speech-language pathologist. I'm terrible at math. So how big of a hard drive do we need? Well, in my opinion, 256 gigabytes is the smallest hard drive we can use. That doesn't mean that we're going to keep a lot of files. In fact, we're going to be using the cloud a lot. But we can also remember that we can plug in extra hard drives when we need to. Now, if we don't want to use extra hard drives, we can also just get a larger drive in the laptop itself. For example, maybe 1 terabyte would be great. However, that's going to cost extra. What about RAM, or random access memory? Well, it's like the working memory area of our prefrontal cortex. It holds all of the information that we're using right now to work on. For example, the list of all the different kinds of penguins so that we can put them in alphabetical order, or the list of materials we need to make a set of wings for our cat. Now, in our brains, we only transfer that information from our long-term memory to our working memory when we actually need it. So we have a lot less working memory than long-term memory, and just like that, our computers have a lot less RAM than they do hard disk space. How much RAM do we need? Well, I think that if you have less than 8 gigabytes of RAM, you're probably not going to be happy with how fast your computer goes, especially if you have 500,000 tabs open in your browser, and I know none of you do. Next is the CPU, or Central Processing Unit. The CPU is a lot like the frontal lobe of our brain. It's where all of that problem solving happens. The CPU and the RAM work together hand in hand to create solutions to the problems, just like we use our frontal lobe and our working memory to do our executive function work. Now, it doesn't matter how much RAM you have if your CPU is too slow to use all of it, and it doesn't matter how fast your CPU is if you don't have enough RAM to supply it with information. Just like it doesn't matter if your working memory is great if your problem-solving skills are impaired, or your problem-solving skills are great but your working memory is impaired. CPU speed is measured in gigahertz. 1 gigahertz is like having 1 billion thoughts per second. So, how many gigahertz do we need? Well, 3 gigahertz is thrown around a lot, but CPUs are kind of strange. It's not like every 3 gigahertz CPU is like every other 3 gigahertz CPU. In fact, the laptop that I use has a 2.5 gigahertz CPU, but it has 4 cores and it does multi-threading. Each of those cores is kind of like its own processor. So really, is it 2.5 gigahertz? Or is it 10 gigahertz? And really, with multi-threading, since I have 2 threads per processor, it doubles each of those. So is it a 20 gigahertz CPU? Well, no, of course it's not a 20 gigahertz CPU. But the point is that it's more complicated than just a number. The reality is that if you buy a modern computer, it's going to have a CPU that's going to work just fine for telepractice. Don't worry if it says 3 gigahertz. Don't worry if it says 2.5 gigahertz. Start to worry if it goes below 2 gigahertz, because that's probably not a very modern CPU. Which brings us to our last part, the GPU, or Graphics Processing Unit. The GPU is like the occipital lobe of our brain. It does all of the visualization work. It takes the information from the CPU and displays it on the screen so that we can see it. Some CPUs have integrated GPUs, which means that the scientists built the GPU right into the CPU chip. This is fine, but what's better is a dedicated GPU. Why is that better? Let me think. That's right, memory and thinking. A dedicated GPU is much better at processing that visual information and displaying it on the screen for us. And it usually has a lot more video RAM, which means that we don't have to worry about using our RAM for our RAM. Wait, we don't have to worry about using our RAM. No, that doesn't work. We don't have to worry about using our RAM for our video. There we go. So what do we do with that information? Well, a dedicated GPU isn't necessary. It's on our nice-to-have list. So if we're spending quite a bit of money on a laptop or a desktop that we want to be really kind of the best we can make it, we're going to want to look for a dedicated GPU just to get that extra work done. So, to sum it up, we want to make sure that the computer we buy has at least 256 gigabytes of hard disk space. We want to make sure that it has at least 8 gigabytes of RAM. We want to make sure that it has a CPU that's at minimum about 2 gigahertz, although faster is generally better. And last, if we're spending extra money, we want to look for something that has a dedicated GPU. Hey, before you go, don't forget to click that subscribe button and notification bell down below so that you get notified when my future content comes out. Also, if you want to leave a comment, I'd really appreciate hearing what you have to say. Do feel free to give me ideas for future content if you'd like. All right, thanks so much. Bye now.